fantasy playing.
Anyway, on to higher things. Eh? So, yes, we're on to 1 Timothy, of course. Did our intro last week, got the first couple of verses. And tonight we're going to look at, again, just 2 verses. And that is verse 3 and verse 4. And I shall read those out to you. As I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia, that thou mightst charge some that they teach no other doctrine, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which minister questions rather than godly edifying, which is in faith, so do. So, doctrine, teaching is in our sights tonight, and not only that, but advice to a young leader, because of course Timothy, remember I said last week, Paul's quite old by this time. Timothy's the younger guy, and Paul is sort of discipling him really, and teaching him how to be a leader, and so there's a number of, I think, simple conclusions that you can come to just from these 2 verses, and I've just come up with 3 to consider. Firstly, sound doctrine or good teaching is important. Secondly, some doctrine, some teaching is unimportant, unnecessary, and even harmful. And thirdly, that leaders have a responsibility to monitor, and if needs be, to forbid certain doctrines from being taught. I'm going to expound a bit on that by going to other verses in the Bible tonight. So we'll come to this again later on, but it's important to recognise Paul's not saying that people can't hold contrary doctrinal opinions. He's not saying nobody's allowed to have their own opinion. In fact, elsewhere in the scriptures, he says there must be factions, or there must be heresies, the King James says. It doesn't really mean it that strongly. It's saying there must be differences of opinion among you. In other words, he's saying it's inevitable that people will have differences of opinion about God. But what he is saying is they cannot teach, either formally or informally, contrary opinions to the apostles to their congregations. You can't allow that to happen. In fact, I would suggest that such action might even result in church discipline, and we'll see that later on. So it's important to get that. He's not saying everybody has to agree with me, but he is saying when it comes to teaching, that's important. And of course, James says, doesn't he, not many of you should be teachers. Not because teachers are held to a higher moral standard than everybody else, but because when you teach somebody, you're actually leading them. You're actually you are accountable for that person, because they're taking on board what you're saying, and therefore you better get it right. So before we go any further, I want to just deal with this first, or rather verse 3, the first one that we're looking at tonight, because it gives us a little bit of background, doesn't it, to this. It says, Paul says, I besought thee to abide still at Ephesus when I went into Macedonia. So there's a bit of geography going on here, and you could quite easily just skip over this and go, oh, right, so he told Timothy, you stay at Ephesus, I'm going to Macedonia. But actually the Bible tells us a little bit of background about why this is going on, and it's perhaps quite important. So just if you turn to Acts chapter 20, you'll see the verse that connects with this. So Acts 20 and verse 1 says, and after the uproar was ceased, Paul called unto him the disciples and embraced them and departed for to go into Macedonia. So there's been something's happened, something's kicked off, there's been a big uproar, and Paul's headed off to Macedonia. And if we want to know what it is, all we have to do is read the chapter before it, Acts 19, and it gives us the details. It tells us that the reason that Paul it has to leave Ephesus is because there's this guy called Demetrius, and Demetrius is a silversmith. He makes things out of silver, and what he makes is idols, so little gods for people to worship. And he's having a meeting with the other craftsmen in Ephesus, and he says something to the effect of, look, this Paul and Apollos, because Apollos is with him, is ruining our business because so many people are becoming Christians, because the gospel's going out, and all these people who used to buy idols off him and now like, hey, we don't need idols anymore because we've got a living God. And so it's actually having an effect on his business, and so they say we've got to do something about it. It's going to be out of business if this carries on. And so you can see in Acts 19, I'll just read you what it says, verse 34. They have this guy. Verse 33. They have this guy Alexander who comes out, who's Jewish. He's trying to calm the people down, but it says in let's go a bit earlier than that. Yeah, verse 26. Let's look at verse 26. It says, moreover, you see and hear that not alone in Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that there be no gods which are made with hands. So that not only is our craft is in danger to be set at naught, and is going to ruin us, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshippeth. And when they heard these sayings, they were full of wrath, and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So they're indignant, they're taking it as an insult to their god, and that's exactly, of course, what he wanted them to do. And so they're basically a real sort of uproar starts. And then, this is what I want to read, verse 34. It says, but when they knew that he was a Jew, this is Alexander, all with one voice, listen to this, for about the space of 2 hours cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. This is their god. So for 2 hours, this is how it had kicked off. They're just kind of shouting for their god. And this is the effect that the gospel has. When the gospel is preached, and when it is preached in truth, it does stir up men and women who don't know God. They either receive it gladly, or generally they get angry, and this is what's happening here. And so that's the background here. Paul's had to sort of hightail it out of there, if you like. And so just coming back then to 1 Timothy, Paul is now, it amazes me. Paul's doing all this stuff. He's preaching the gospel, and he's also sort of running the churches. Not just one church. It's just incredible that he has that much energy and so on. But of course, it's the grace of God. So verse 4 said, neither give heed to fables and endless genealogies which minister questions, rather than godly edifying, which is in faith, so do. So Paul is charging Timothy about the issue of false teaching or false teachers. Because what's happening is that there are certain people in the church who are sort of nitpicking, splitting hairs, being pedantic about things that are really, secondary issues. And what it's doing is it's taking up everybody's time. And partly the reason why I've been preaching on practical theology is, one, doctrine's important, theology is important, but if it doesn't have a practical purpose, if you can't apply it in your life as a Christian, then you're actually wasting everybody's time, because they're just kind of, oh yeah, that's interesting, kind of wrestling with it. But if it doesn't lead to sharing the gospel with somebody, or it doesn't lead to walking in holiness, I question as to what value it really has. And I think this is what Paul is saying here is, there are people and they're disputing and they're arguing about genealogies. They're arguing about these things, and I have to say, as a preacher and as a teacher, there's nothing more frustrating, for preachers and teachers, and for those who want to learn from them, to have people who constantly interrupt, constantly object, constantly sort of want to ask a question. I don't agree with that, or I think, because what it does is it interrupts your train of thought. When you're preaching, when you're teaching, you tend to get into a train of thought where you feel that, like, if it's going well, it's going really well, you really feel as if the Holy Spirit is kind of leading you on. And so you get into a kind of a flow. And to have someone constantly being contentious, it's frustrating for everybody, for those who are doing the teaching, and also for those who've come to learn, because they can't learn, they have to keep stopping and starting. And so I think this is what Paul is saying is, Timothy, you have to deal with those who are insisting on being pedantic or petty about doubtful doctrines, about those things that which there is no kind of, some things are matters of conscience, some things explicitly taught in the scripture, without doubt, adultery is wrong, stealing is wrong. But there are other things that there are a number of opinions about. Some are matters of conscience. Paul even says when it comes down to things like eating meat or not eating meat, even if you know that there's absolutely nothing wrong with eating meat, it's absolutely fine, God has blessed it, that if you have a weaker brother who has a problem with it, then don't eat meat. So some things are matters of conscience, not necessarily this is right, this is wrong. But these are people who are taking secondary things and really, really making big issues out of them. Let's have a look at Titus chapter 1, see what it says about false teachers. So Titus chapter 1. So this is talking about bishops or elders, if you like, and the qualities that you hope they have. Verse 9 says that they will be holding fast the faithful word as he hath been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers. A gainsayer is somebody who is saying something against. Yeah, makes sense. For there are many unruly and vain talkers, or empty talkers, and deceivers, especially they of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole houses, teaching things which they ought not, for filthy lucre's sake, for money, basically, or if not actually for money, for some sort of gain for themselves. And these are really important points here. Those of the circumcision are basically certain Jewish Christians who were trying to say, well, you need to obey the laws of Moses. So they're teaching things that are part of the old covenant, they're not part of the new covenant, and they're trying to impose certain restrictions upon Christians. And I think quite often those people who are pedantic and contentious and always arguing and always quarrelling and always saying, well, I don't really see it like that, and quite often they are that kind of character. They want to impose extra biblical laws on people. Well, you shouldn't really be doing this, you shouldn't really be doing that. They tend to be legalistic, and Paul is saying to Timothy, look, you need to watch out for these people. and you need to be careful. I mean, here in Titus, what did it say? That they subvert whole houses. In other words, they're affecting entire families. That's what it is. A house is a family in King James. So whole families are being diverted away from the truth and diverted away from the gospel by these people. So obviously that's serious, isn't it? It's not just like, oh well, everybody should be allowed to speak. Everybody, as I said before, Paul isn't saying you can't have your own opinion. What he's saying is there's a restriction on what is taught because it affects the congregation. If you're going to have a congregation that is cohesive, that is of one mind, then you have to have, I think, a standard teaching. And this is what me and Matthew always used to agree on, because he used to do the teaching as well on a Tuesday night, is that he would used to say to me, what is our position on this? If there was something tricky, something difficult, and we weren't quite sure what we thought about it, he'd say, well, what position are we going to take? Because we understood it's important that we come to some kind of consensus so that we can teach the same thing. Because other words, if we don't do that, then one week I'm going to be teaching one thing, he's going to come up the week after and treat it completely differently. Well, that doesn't. Some people would say, oh well, that gives different points of view. That's helpful, but it's not. If one contradicts the other, people just get confused, And when you're doing these sort of studies, particularly when you're going almost verse by verse through an entire book of the Bible, you want people to see how it holds together, not how many different views there are, but you want them to come away with something solid that they can say, yeah, I think I've understood that, and then it aids their own personal study then. So this is quite important, and I think it teaches that whatever you want to call them, leaders, teachers, pastors, elders, have a responsibility not just to teach faithfully, if you like, skillfully, knowledgeably, but actually to stop the mouths. That's what it said in it, to stop the mouths of the contentious. And I think, if I remember rightly, that verse means like when you put a bit in a horse's mouth and you kind of you pull on one. Of course, I'm the expert on horse right now. Yeah, you put the bit in the horse's mouth and you pull on one rein and the horse goes that way. You pull the other and it goes the other way. And it's to sort of say, look, take hold of that person who's doing this teaching and say no, and you pull them away. And I think that is the picture here. But to do it not to do it sort of how would you say, not by being dictatorial, not by putting the person in the place or pulling rank, but through the word of God. And that's why positions of leadership in churches should be given to mature Christians, or to when I say mature, I mean spiritually mature Christians who know the word of God, who know what they're teaching, so that they are able to refute those who are speaking false doctrine. And in fact, in chapter 4, this becomes a bit of a theme really in Timothy. Chapter 4, Paul tells Timothy, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, or doctrines of demons. So this is not just impractical doctrines, is it? This is not just contentious doctrines, but it's something more disturbing than that. There's one of the commentators compares the teaching of the apostles to the teaching of these false teachers, and I quite liked what he said. It's not Wesley, by the way. I quite liked what he said. He said, healthy teaching is sound and practical. And I'd agree with that. I think it is. I think it has to have an application. Healthy teaching is sound and practical, and is here compared with that sickly, morbid, and unpractical teaching of those gainsayers. That's an older commentator, but I like the way he puts that. He's saying it's unhealthy teaching, because it doesn't have any practical use, and what it does, it absorbs people and actually renders their Christian lives unfruitful. So these are serious issues, and no wonder then that Paul is saying that behind some of these doctrines there are demons, because that's in the devil's interest, isn't it? To have someone so absorbed with a particular subject that they're not actually living out the Christian life. They're just going deeper and deeper into these thoughts and convincing them that they're actually doing something good, convincing them they're actually doing something Christian, when in actual fact they're just wasting their time and other people's time, and stopping those who want to teach sound doctrine, healthy teaching. So there is a responsibility here for leaders to deal with that, and I have to say, whilst no reasonable person wants to spend their time reproving others, it's actually no fun. I hate having to do it. I have had to do it occasionally in the past, but I don't enjoy doing it. But it shows that, I'll say this: you should choose your teachers carefully. Choose who you allow to teach you very carefully, because it will have an effect on your lives. And you, when it comes to the congregation and a relationship with the congregation to those who are teaching them, you should want your shepherd to protect and to convince and to refute the gainsayers. He should be standing up and protecting you, because that's what shepherds do to their flock, isn't it? Particularly in biblical times, not only did they feed them and care for them, but they protected them from wolves. No one wants wolves teaching the sheep, and we definitely want to keep out the sort of unclean doctrines of wicked spirits, if that's what's coming through here. So I guess you would say, well, how do you know? What if you could apply a sort of a litmus test, so you can sort through, well, what is God teaching me? Because we can teach one another, can't we? The Bible says that. It says that older women can teach younger women. It says that older men can teach younger men. So we can in a sense teach one another. But how do you know if that person, if it's actually God's Spirit teaching you, or whether it's something more sinister or just simply coming out of the person's flesh? Well, Luke 6:45 says this. Jesus says, "A good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. For of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaketh." So what I'd say is this: I'd ask questions to yourself, if you like, and not exactly a question, but the sort of questions that I'd be asking would be: does this teaching, or does this person edify me, build me up with their teaching? What did it say in 1 Timothy there? It said that these false teachers, they teach things which minister questions. In other words, they beg questions rather than godly edifying. So that's what we're looking for, godly edifying. Does this build me up, or is it bringing me down? So that'd be one of the questions that I'd ask. Is it building me up, or is it bringing me down? Does being in their company have me heading for the Bible. You know, if I kind of sit and listen to them for a bit, I think, brilliant, yeah, I'm going to get my Bible out, I'm going to look at that, because that's really, it's got me fired up, it's got me interested, I want to read the Bible. Does it have me heading for the Bible, or does it have me heading for, I don't know, the fridge and the ice cream, or the drinks cabinet? Oh man. You know, if it's putting you off even reading the Bible, then I think that's an important warning. Do I want to learn more, or do I wish that they would just be quiet? Maybe you sometimes say that if I've gone on a bit, but you know, these are the litmus tests, I think, for if it's of God. Do I want to learn more, or do I wish they'd be quiet? Is it drawing me closer to God, or is it actually driving me away from God? Is it making me seek refuge in my flesh? And so I think just a simple litmus test. You know when something's of God. You know if you're in a meeting and let's say you're praising God or something like that, and you become aware of the presence of God. You know it's God. You know that, oh, this is the Spirit of God moving, and I just sense it. I just know it is. And it's the same with teaching. When you get good teaching, when you get, taught something from the Bible, and you know this is God, you know this is the Spirit of God teaching you, there's an excitement. There's an excitement. There's sometimes it might be a chat. I'm not saying it's not challenging. Sometimes things are really challenging, but the result is that we think, yes, I need to deal with that. There's a sense in which we want it. If you're a real Christian, you want it. You want to deal with it. You want to get with it. If it's false teaching, if it's not coming from the Spirit of God, it's a big sort of spiritual turn off. It's like, I don't want this. I don't want to listen to this person. This is just, it's putting me right off reading my Bible, this. And so I think they're simple and logical litmus tests that you would use. If it's from the Spirit of God, then it's going to quicken my spirit. Because we looked at it, Christ's in me. So it will, my spirit will respond. If it's not of God and it's not of His Spirit, then I'm not going to want to hear it, because what does Jesus say? My sheep hear my voice and they follow me. And so that's how, one of the ways in which you know that it's the Spirit of God or the Spirit of truth or error.